Chapter 1. The Betrayal. Emma Black stood in the center of her sleek, modern office, gazing out at the city skyline from the large windows. It was a stunning view, the city lights twinkling like stars below. She had always loved this time of day, the transition from daylight to twilight symbolizing hope and possibility. But today that hope felt distant, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. She had just returned from a meeting with her closest colleagues, David Harris, Rachel King, and Thomas Riley. They had been working together for years, building a successful law firm from the ground up. Emma had always admired their ambition and drive, believing them to be true friends as well as colleagues. But now, something had changed. An unsettling whisper of corruption had begun to circulate in the back of her mind, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Emma had discovered discrepancies in the firm's financial records, evidence of significant embezzlement. She had approached David, Rachel, and Thomas with her findings, hoping they would address the issue together. Their reaction was not what she had expected. Instead of concern or surprise, she had seen fear in their eyes, a flicker of something darker lurking beneath their professional facades. "Emma, we need to talk," David had said, his voice strained. "This isn't something we can just handle internally. There's a lot more at stake here." Emma had sensed a shift in their demeanor, an unspoken tension that prickled at the edges of her consciousness. But she had brushed it off, determined to get to the bottom of the matter. She would not let her friends, her partners, become part of the problem. As the days went by, Emma's unease grew. She continued to dig into the firm's accounts, finding more and more evidence of financial misconduct. Each discovery seemed to confirm her worst fears, that her colleagues were involved in something deeply corrupt. She felt a growing sense of urgency to expose the truth, to stop them before their actions caused even more harm. Then, one fateful morning, Emma received a call from the police. They informed her that she was being investigated for embezzlement. Shocked and confused, Emma tried to protest her innocence, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Evidence had been planted, and the case against her seemed insurmountable. The trial was a whirlwind of legal jargon and courtroom drama. Despite her best efforts, Emma was unable to clear her name. The prosecution presented fabricated evidence that painted her as the mastermind behind the embezzlement scheme. The weight of the accusations and the overwhelming pressure from the legal system took their toll on Emma. Her friends, David, Rachel, and Thomas, seemed to have vanished from her life entirely, leaving her to face the storm alone. When the verdict was delivered, Emma was stunned. Guilty. The words echoed in her mind as she was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs. Her world, once filled with promise and ambition, had crumbled into a dark, suffocating abyss. Her life in prison was a constant struggle. The conditions were harsh, and she was subjected to isolation and mistreatment. The guards were indifferent to her plight, and her fellow inmates seemed to sense her vulnerability, preying on her like wolves circling their prey. Emma's hope began to wane, and the weight of her situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Emma's health deteriorated, both physically and mentally. The harsh reality of prison life took its toll, and she became a shadow of her former self. The walls of her cell seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with a sense of hopelessness. Then one night, Emma was found dead in her cell. The official report declared it a suicide, an act of despair from a woman who had lost everything. But there were whispers among the prison staff, rumors of foul play. Emma's death was surrounded by an air of suspicion and mystery, but the official narrative remained unchanged. Emma's spirit lingered in the prison, bound by the anguish of her untimely death. Her once vibrant life had been extinguished, and she was left to wander the cold, sterile halls of the prison, trapped between worlds. The sense of betrayal and injustice burned brightly within her, fueling a restless anger that refused to be extinguished. In her former apartment, Emma's spirit began to manifest. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of light, a cold draft, an unexplained noise. But as the days passed, her presence grew more pronounced. Her former colleagues, now living comfortably in their corruption, began to experience unsettling disturbances. Emma's ghostly manifestations were not mere pranks. They were a prelude to something much more profound. Emma's death had been shrouded in secrecy, but the truth was starting to surface. Her spirit, now driven by a burning desire for revenge, was determined to expose the corruption that had led to her downfall. The echoes of her former life reverberated through the empty rooms, her presence a haunting reminder of the wrongs that had been done. The betrayal that had shattered her life had not been forgotten. It lived on in the restless spirit of Emma Black, a specter seeking justice in a world that had turned its back on her. Her quest for vengeance was only beginning, and the path ahead would be one of darkness and retribution. Chapter 2: The Awakening. Emma Black's spirit stirred in the shadows of her old apartment. The once familiar space, now tinged with an eerie luminescence, was a stark contrast to the life it had once held. The furniture was coated in a thin layer of dust, and the windows, once a gateway to the vibrant city outside, were now dark and opaque. The apartment felt like a mausoleum, a place frozen in time, where echoes of her past life reverberated with every creak of the floorboards. At first, Emma was disoriented. She floated through the apartment, her ghostly form passing through walls and furniture as if they were mere illusions. Memories of her life began to return in fragmented flashes. Her laughter with friends, the thrill of success, and the crushing weight of betrayal. The reality of her death had yet to fully sink in. She felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. She was free from physical pain, but imprisoned by her spectral existence. Emma's initial attempts to interact with the living world were clumsy. She tried to move objects, but her ethereal hands passed through them as if they were made of smoke. The cold drafts she created were barely noticeable, and the eerie whispers she attempted to summon were lost in the ambient noise of the city. She felt powerless, her ability to impact the world limited by her ghostly nature. Gradually, Emma began to understand her new form. She discovered she could influence her surroundings in subtle ways: flickering lights, rustling papers, and the occasional drop in temperature. These small disturbances were her first steps toward asserting her presence. The realization that she could still affect the world, even in such a limited capacity, ignited a spark of determination within her. Her focus shifted to her former colleagues, the ones responsible for her downfall. Emma's spectral form was not bound by the physical limitations that had once restricted her. She could travel to their homes, follow them to their workplaces, and observe their lives from the shadows. The stark contrast between their prosperous lives and her own tragic fate fueled her resolve. Emma began to manifest more frequently, appearing as fleeting shadows and glimpses in the corners of their eyes. Her former colleagues, David, Rachel, and Thomas, were initially oblivious to her presence. They continued their lives, seemingly unaffected by the unsettling occurrences. However, Emma's growing frustration pushed her to escalate her efforts. David, the first of her betrayers, began to experience strange phenomena in his home. Late at night, he would hear unexplained noises, scratching at the walls, whispers in the dark, and the occasional thud. His once peaceful nights were now plagued by insomnia. He would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that something was lurking just out of sight. The mounting fear was eating away at his composure, but he remained skeptical of any supernatural explanations. Rachel, on the other hand, was experiencing more direct disturbances. Emma's presence manifested in her office, where documents would inexplicably go missing and her computer would randomly shut down. Rachel's frustration with these technical malfunctions grew, and she began to feel as if she were being watched. Her anxiety manifested in physical symptoms: headaches, nausea, and unexplained shivers. Despite her growing unease, she dismissed these events as mere coincidences. Thomas was the most affected by Emma's hauntings. His apartment was a haven of fear. Emma's spectral form would appear in the reflection of mirrors, and cold spots would suddenly chill the room. His nights were plagued by nightmares, vivid dreams of his own guilt and the consequences of his actions. The relentless terror began to erode his sanity, leaving him on the brink of a breakdown. Emma observed their reactions with a mix of satisfaction and disappointment. Her attempts to communicate or directly confront them were limited by her ghostly limitations. She could cause fear, but she couldn't yet force them to acknowledge her presence or understand the true nature of their torment. One evening, Emma decided to take a more direct approach. She visited Rachel's apartment, appearing in the darkened living room. Rachel was alone, her expression a mix of exhaustion and anxiety. Emma's form flickered in and out of view, manifesting as a chilling breeze and a whispering voice that barely penetrated the noise of the city outside. Rachel was seated on her couch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp. As Emma's presence intensified, the lamp flickered and dimmed. Rachel looked around, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, causing her breath to mist in the air. Emma's whispers grew more distinct, forming fragmented words that Rachel couldn't quite decipher. In a moment of clarity, Rachel stood up and moved to the window, hoping the fresh air would dispel the creeping chill. As she opened the window, the gust of wind seemed to carry Emma's voice, clearer now. Rachel shuddered, her heart racing as she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She turned abruptly, but there was no one there. The experience left Rachel shaken, and she began to question her own sanity. She sought solace in her work, hoping that immersing herself in her tasks would help her forget the unsettling occurrences. But the haunting continued, persistent and relentless. Emma's haunting had begun to have an impact. The fear she instilled in her betrayers was palpable, and their lives were becoming increasingly disrupted. Yet Emma knew this was only the beginning. Her goal was not just to scare them, but to make them confront the truth of their actions. She needed to expose their corruption and ensure that justice was served, even if it meant navigating the complexities of her ghostly existence. As Emma continued her quest, her presence became more forceful, her manifestations more dramatic. The boundaries between the living and the dead seemed to blur, and Emma's spectral form grew more defined. Her resolve was unwavering, and she was determined to make her former colleagues face the consequences of their actions. The path to vengeance was fraught with challenges, but Emma was undeterred. She was driven by a burning desire for justice, and her spirit would not rest until she had achieved it. Her haunting was a prelude to a larger plan, one that would require patience, cunning, and persistence. With each passing day, Emma's influence grew stronger. She was no longer a mere shadow of her former self, but a force to be reckoned with. Her quest for vengeance was just beginning, and the road ahead was filled with darkness and uncertainty. But Emma was ready to confront whatever lay in her path, driven by a relentless determination to see justice done. Chapter 3: The Unseen Terror. Emma Black's ethereal presence continued to stir unrest among her former colleagues. Her haunting had shifted from mere disturbances to a more deliberate and intense campaign of psychological torment. The boundaries between the living and the dead were blurring, and Emma's spirit became a shadowy figure of dread in the lives of those who had wronged her. David Harris was the first to break under the pressure. The once confident lawyer found himself increasingly plagued by insomnia. His nights were filled with nightmares where Emma's face loomed in the darkness, her eyes full of accusation and sorrow. During the day, he would catch glimpses of her spectral form out of the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The stress began to affect his performance at work, causing tension among his colleagues and drawing unwanted attention. One evening, as David was working late in his office, the building's lights began to flicker erratically. He glanced up from his desk, his heart pounding. The room grew cold, and a sense of foreboding enveloped him. He tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to fatigue. But then, the office door creaked open by itself, and David felt a chill run down his spine. The temperature plummeted, and he heard a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to echo through the empty office. "David." The voice called, barely audible but unmistakably chilling. David's hands trembled as he grabbed his phone, dialing a colleague to ensure he wasn't alone. But when he looked up, the office was empty, and the door was firmly shut. He took a deep breath, trying to rationalize the experience. Yet, as he left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The oppressive sense of dread followed him home, casting a pall over his once safe sanctuary. Rachel King's experience was equally unsettling. The disturbances in her apartment had escalated to a point where she could no longer ignore them. her once immaculate living space was now plagued by inexplicable occurrences. The refrigerator would open on its own, and the television would turn on to static channels in the dead of night. Rachel's attempts to seek comfort in her daily routines were thwarted by the persistent presence of Emma's spirit. One night, Rachel was in the middle of preparing dinner when she noticed a peculiar smell in the air, burning, acrid, like something was smoldering. She rushed to the kitchen, but everything seemed normal. The smell persisted, growing stronger until it filled the apartment. Rachel tried to locate the source, but the more she searched, the more the smell seemed to envelop her. She began to feel a suffocating pressure in her chest, and her hands shook as she attempted to calm herself. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Rachel's breathing quickened, and she stumbled towards the door, but it was stuck. The darkness was thick and oppressive, and the temperature dropped sharply. She could hear the faint, eerie sound of footsteps echoing through the apartment. Rachel's panic reached a fever pitch as she pounded on the door, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness and the unseen terror that seemed to close in on her. Thomas Riley was the most profoundly affected by Emma's haunting. His apartment had become a nightmarish landscape of fear and paranoia. Emma's presence was most palpable here, with manifestations growing increasingly violent and invasive. Thomas's dreams were haunted by Emma's tormented visage, her ghostly hands reaching out for him as he lay paralyzed in bed. One evening, as Thomas sat alone in his dimly lit living room, he noticed that the air was growing colder. The temperature dropped rapidly, and a dense fog began to form around him. The fog thickened until it obscured his vision. He could feel a cold, clammy presence brushing against his skin, and he heard whispering voices that seemed to come from all directions. Thomas tried to stand, but his legs felt leaden. He could see faint, ghostly figures moving within the fog, their shapes shifting and undulating. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words that made no sense. The fog seemed to close in on him, and he was overwhelmed by a sense of dread. In a fit of panic, he reached for his phone, but it slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. When the fog finally dissipated, Thomas was left gasping for breath, his face pale and sweat-soaked. The fear had left him shaken, and he struggled to rationalize the experience. He convinced himself it was a bad dream or a figment of his imagination, but the terror remained, gnawing at his sanity. As Emma's haunting grew more intense, her former colleagues began to unravel. The psychological torment took its toll on their mental and emotional stability. Their lives, once marked by confidence and control, were now dominated by fear and paranoia. Emma's spectral presence had succeeded in destabilizing their worlds, but her mission was far from complete. Emma knew she needed to escalate her efforts if she wanted to force her betrayers to confront the truth. She began to focus on more direct forms of intervention. Her goal was not just to frighten them, but to make them face their guilt and the consequences of their actions. One evening, Emma decided to visit David again. She manifested in his office, her form shimmering with an otherworldly glow. David was alone, working late into the night, and the atmosphere in the office was thick with tension. Emma's presence was immediately palpable, and the room grew icy cold. David looked up from his work, his eyes widening in terror as he saw Emma's ghostly form materialize before him. She moved toward him, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The office lights flickered violently, and the air was charged with a palpable sense of dread. David's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he faced the apparition of the woman he had wronged. Emma extended a spectral hand toward David, and he felt an overwhelming sense of despair and remorse. Her ghostly voice filled the room, echoing with a mournful intensity. "David, why?" she asked, her voice a haunting whisper. David's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his cries of anguish echoing through the empty office. The realization of his actions and the impact they had on Emma's life hit him with a crushing force. The fear he had tried to suppress became a torrent of guilt and remorse, and he was left to confront the consequences of his betrayal. Emma's presence lingered, her haunting far from over. She had succeeded in striking fear into the hearts of her betrayers, but her ultimate goal was to see justice served. The path to vengeance was fraught with challenges, but Emma's spirit was unwavering. Her haunting was a testament to her determination, and she was prepared to continue her quest until her former colleagues faced the full measure of their guilt. The road ahead was uncertain, but Emma was resolute. Her vengeance would not be denied, and the echoes of her suffering would reverberate through the lives of those who had wronged her. The shadows of her past had become a force of reckoning, and Emma was prepared to see her quest for justice through to its end. Chapter 4. The Confrontation. As the days passed, Emma Black's spectral influence continued to wreak havoc on the lives of her former colleagues. Each of them was grappling with their own personal demons, the result of Emma's relentless pursuit of vengeance. Her presence was now a constant, gnawing fear that consumed their thoughts and disrupted their lives. Rachel King, increasingly distraught, sought solace in her faith. She began visiting a local church, hoping that the spiritual sanctuary might offer some relief from the haunting experiences that plagued her. The church, with its serene atmosphere and sacred rituals, seemed like a refuge from the unseen terror that had taken over her life. One evening, as Rachel sat in the dimly lit church, she prayed fervently for peace and protection. The soft glow of candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, and the scent of incense filled the air. Despite her efforts to seek comfort, Rachel felt an unsettling presence lurking in the corners of the church. Emma's spectral form appeared in the church's sanctuary, her ghostly presence cloaked in the shadows. Rachel's prayer was interrupted by a cold draft that swept through the room, extinguishing several candles in a gust of wind. The temperature dropped abruptly, and Rachel shivered as a sense of dread washed over her. The church's ambiance, once a source of solace, now seemed to amplify Rachel's fear. The echoes of her prayers mingled with the haunting whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. Emma's presence grew more tangible, and the chill in the air became almost suffocating. Rachel rose from her seat, her eyes wide with terror as she looked around the darkened sanctuary. She could feel Emma's ghostly presence closing in on her, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. Her attempts to leave the church were thwarted as the doors remained stubbornly shut and the windows were covered in an opaque, ghostly mist. In a moment of desperation, Rachel clutched a small silver cross she wore around her neck, hoping it would offer her some protection. She called out for help, her voice trembling with fear. The church's silence was broken only by the eerie sound of Emma's whispers, growing more distinct and menacing. "Rachel," the voice echoed, filled with sorrow and anger. "You cannot escape the truth." Rachel's fear reached its peak as the church's altar candles flickered and extinguished one by one. The once sacred space had become a dark, oppressive environment, and Rachel was overwhelmed by a sense of impending doom. Her faith, once a source of comfort, now seemed inadequate against the malevolent force that haunted her. Emma's presence loomed over Rachel, her ghostly figure appearing more defined and menacing. The spectral hand reached out, and Rachel felt a cold touch on her shoulder. She gasped, her heart racing as she turned to face the apparition. Emma's eyes, once filled with sorrow, now blazed with an intense, vengeful fire. "You betrayed me," Emma's voice resonated through the church, filled with anguish and fury. "You must face the consequences of your actions." Rachel fell to her knees, her tears mixing with her pleas for forgiveness. She tried to explain that she hadn't meant to cause harm, but her words were swallowed by the darkness. Emma's presence was overwhelming, and Rachel's pleas seemed to have no effect on the vengeful spirit. Meanwhile, David Harris was struggling to maintain his grip on reality. The psychological torment he endured had reached new heights, and he was barely holding it together. His once confident demeanor had eroded into a shell of paranoia and fear. David sought refuge in his office, hoping that the familiar surroundings might provide some sense of normalcy. However, Emma's influence had extended into every corner of his life, and the office was no sanctuary. The lights flickered incessantly, and strange noises emanated from the walls, as if the very building itself was conspiring against him. One evening, David sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he tried to focus on his work. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unsettling cacophony. He could hear Emma's voice, though distorted and fragmented, calling out his name. "David," the voice echoed, chilling and mournful. "You cannot escape your guilt." David tried to block out the sounds, but the whispers became more insistent. His anxiety reached a breaking point as he felt an icy presence close in on him. The room grew colder, and the air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. In a fit of panic, David stood up, knocking over his chair. He stumbled toward the door, but it was locked, the handle refusing to budge. He pounded on the door, desperate to escape the claustrophobic confines of his office. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the whispers grew louder, more accusing. Thomas Riley's life continued to spiral into chaos. The fear and paranoia that plagued him had begun to affect his work and personal relationships. He was constantly on edge, unable to find solace in the routine of his life. Emma's haunting presence had become an inescapable reality, and Thomas was grappling with the crushing weight of his guilt. One night, as Thomas lay in bed, he heard a faint, ghostly whisper that seemed to come from the darkness around him. The room grew icy cold, and he felt an oppressive presence hovering over him. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented phrases that echoed his deepest fears. "Thomas," the voice murmured, filled with anger and sorrow, "you cannot hide from the truth." Thomas sat up in bed, his heart racing as he scanned the room for any sign of the apparition. The shadows danced along the walls, and the temperature continued to drop. He could feel Emma's presence growing stronger, and the fear that gripped him was almost paralyzing. In his desperation, Thomas grabbed a flashlight and shone it around the room, but the light revealed nothing. The whispers continued, and the sense of dread only intensified. Thomas could feel the weight of Emma's anger bearing down on him, and he was consumed by a profound sense of guilt and remorse. As Emma's haunting continued to escalate, the lives of her former colleagues were unraveling. Their once stable worlds had been turned upside down by the relentless pursuit of the vengeful spirit. Emma's presence had become a force of reckoning, and her quest for justice was far from over. The confrontation with each of her betrayers was only the beginning. Emma's vengeance was a powerful and all-consuming force, and she was determined to see it through to its conclusion. Her spectral presence was a constant reminder of the consequences of betrayal, and she was prepared to make her former colleagues face the full measure of their guilt. With each passing day, Emma's influence grew stronger. Her haunting had become a relentless pursuit, and her former colleagues were left to grapple with the consequences of their actions. The road to vengeance was fraught with challenges, but Emma's resolve was unshakable. The echoes of her suffering reverberated through the lives of those who had wronged her, and Emma was prepared to see her quest for justice through to its end. Her spectral presence was a constant reminder of the price of betrayal, and she would not rest until her former colleagues had faced the full weight of their guilt. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The relentless hauntings of Emma Black had driven her former colleagues to the brink of madness. The chilling whispers, cold drafts, and unsettling manifestations had created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear. Yet, despite their growing terror, the trio of David Harris, Rachel King, and Thomas Riley had been slow to come to terms with the truth of their actions and the consequences they faced. Emma's relentless pursuit reached a critical juncture as she prepared for a final decisive confrontation. Her spectral presence was no longer just an ethereal torment. It had become a palpable force of reckoning. Each of her former colleagues was now facing the full weight of their guilt and the price of their betrayal. David Harris, his sanity fraying, decided to seek help from a psychic medium. Desperate for answers and hoping to rid himself of Emma's relentless torment, David contacted a renowned medium named Lydia Hart. Lydia was known for her ability to communicate with spirits and had a reputation for resolving hauntings. David hoped that she might provide a solution to his nightmare. One evening, Lydia arrived at David's office, her demeanor calm and professional. David welcomed her with a mixture of hope and desperation, guiding her to his workspace, where the haunting had been most intense. Lydia began her work, setting up candles and incense, creating an atmosphere conducive to spiritual communication. As Lydia began to perform her ritual, the room grew colder, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Lydia's voice took on a rhythmic, hypnotic quality as she called out to any spirits present, attempting to establish contact. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and David watched with bated breath, hoping for some form of resolution. Emma's presence soon made itself known. The lights flickered violently, and a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing several candles. Lydia's eyes narrowed as she sensed the spirit's powerful and vengeful energy. She began to communicate with Emma, attempting to understand her motives and find a way to resolve the situation. David's fear was palpable as Lydia spoke to the spirit. He could hear Emma's mournful and accusatory voice echoing through the room. Lydia, despite her professional composure, was visibly unsettled by the intensity of the spirit's anger. "Emma Black," Lydia spoke clearly, "I understand you seek justice, but what is it you want from David?" Emma's voice, cold and filled with sorrow, filled the room. "I want them to know the consequences of their betrayal. I want them to face the truth." Lydia turned to David, her expression serious. "Emma's seeking acknowledgement of her suffering and justice for what was done to her. She wants you to confront your actions and make amends." David, overwhelmed by a mix of fear and guilt, attempted to speak, but his voice faltered. The gravity of Emma's demands was sinking in, and he realized that no amount of pleading or rationalization could undo the harm he had caused. Lydia attempted to negotiate with Emma, proposing a way for David to make amends and find some form of closure. Emma's anger was palpable, but Lydia's words seemed to resonate with her. The tension in the room was thick as Lydia worked to broker a resolution that might bring peace to the restless spirit. Rachel King, meanwhile, was in the midst of her own crisis. The haunting experiences she had endured had taken a severe toll on her mental and emotional well-being. Her nights were plagued by nightmares, and her days were filled with a persistent sense of dread. Despite her efforts to seek refuge in the church, she felt increasingly isolated and powerless. Rachel's fear drove her to seek help from a local priest, Father Michael, known for his work with troubled souls and spiritual crises. Father Michael listened to Rachel's harrowing experiences with empathy and concern, agreeing to perform a cleansing ritual to dispel the malevolent spirit. The church, once a place of solace for Rachel, was now the site of a dramatic confrontation between the living and the dead. Father Michael began his ritual, chanting prayers and using holy water to sanctify the space. Rachel watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation, hoping that the ritual might provide the relief she so desperately needed. As Father Michael continued his prayers, the room grew colder, and the atmosphere became charged with a palpable sense of unease. Rachel could feel Emma's presence closing in on her, and the oppressive sense of dread grew more intense. The candles flickered and dimmed, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Emma's ghostly form materialized in the church, her appearance more defined and menacing than ever before. Father Michael's prayers grew more urgent as he confronted the spirit, invoking the power of the divine to banish the malevolent force. Rachel could see the conflict between the priest and the vengeful spirit unfolding before her. Emma's spectral form was filled with rage and sorrow, and the struggle between the forces of good and evil was intense. The church's sanctity was a battleground for the confrontation between Rachel's fear and Emma's unrelenting vengeance. Father Michael's voice echoed through the church as he recited sacred texts and invoked divine protection. The air was thick with spiritual tension, and the atmosphere seemed to vibrate with the clash of forces. Emma's ghostly form flickered and wavered, but her anger remained a powerful and palpable force. The ritual continued, and Rachel could feel the strain of the spiritual struggle taking its toll on her. The church's once peaceful ambience had become a battleground of spiritual conflict, and Rachel's sense of hope and fear wavered as she witnessed the intense confrontation. Thomas Riley, struggling with his own fears, decided to confront his tormentor directly. He sought out Emma's former residence, hoping to find some form of resolution or understanding. The house, long abandoned and shrouded in decay, was a place of palpable dread. As Thomas entered the dark, decrepit house, he was overwhelmed by a sense of foreboding. The walls seemed to whisper with the echoes of the past, and the air was thick with a sense of sorrow and despair. Thomas moved through the house, hoping to find some clue or explanation for the haunting that had consumed his life. In the basement, Thomas discovered a hidden room filled with personal belongings and artifacts. Among the items were photographs of Emma and documents related to her life. The discovery left Thomas with a profound sense of guilt and realization. The tangible evidence of Emma's life and suffering was a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. As Thomas examined the items, he felt a cold, unsettling presence in the room. Emma's ghostly form materialized before him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. Thomas was overcome with a sense of dread and guilt as he faced the spectral figure of the woman he had wronged. Emma's voice, filled with anguish, echoed through the room. "Thomas, do you see now? Do you understand the weight of your actions?" Thomas was left to confront the reality of his guilt and the impact of his betrayal. The encounter with Emma was a powerful and sobering moment, and Thomas was forced to reckon with the consequences of his past actions. The stage was set for a final confrontation. Emma's quest for vengeance had reached a critical point, and her former colleagues were now facing the full measure of their guilt. The haunting had become a force of reckoning, and Emma was prepared to see her quest for justice through to its conclusion. With each of her former colleagues facing their own crises, Emma's presence remained a powerful and unrelenting force. Her spectral quest for vengeance had become a transformative and all-encompassing journey, and the final act of her haunting was yet to unfold. Chapter 6. The Final Judgment. The chilling saga of Emma Black's vengeance had reached its climax. Her former colleagues were now living in a constant state of dread, each grappling with their own demons and the oppressive force of the vengeful spirit. The time had come for Emma to make her final move, to deliver the ultimate judgment upon those who had betrayed her. Rachel King's desperate plea for relief had resulted in a tenuous truce with Emma, facilitated by Father Michael's ritual. However, the resolution remained elusive, as Emma's spirit refused to be placated. Rachel's hope for redemption seemed increasingly distant, overshadowed by the persistent fear of the vengeful ghost's demands. Rachel's nights were filled with tormenting dreams, visions of Emma's angry, accusing face. The once revered church now seemed a hollow sanctuary, haunted by echoes of Emma's sorrow and rage. Despite Father Michael's best efforts, the feeling of unrest lingered, and Rachel's attempts to find solace were in vain. In her desperation, Rachel reached out to her remaining allies, David Harris and Thomas Riley, urging them to join her in a final effort to confront the specter of Emma Black. The trio, united by their shared experiences and fear, resolved to confront their past actions and seek a resolution to the haunting that had consumed their lives. Their meeting was arranged in an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, a place rumored to be a site of supernatural activity. The house, with its decaying walls and dusty furnishings, provided a fitting backdrop for the climactic confrontation with Emma. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as the three former colleagues gathered, each burdened by their own sense of guilt and trepidation. As they entered the mansion, the temperature dropped sharply, and a sense of foreboding enveloped them. The dim light of their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and the silence was occasionally broken by the distant creak of the old house settling. David, Rachel, and Thomas gathered in the main hall, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their candles. They had prepared for this moment, each bringing items of significance from their past actions to demonstrate their remorse. Father Michael, having agreed to assist them, was present to offer spiritual guidance and perform a final cleansing ritual. The ritual began with Father Michael reciting prayers and blessings, attempting to create a protective barrier around the group. Emma's presence was soon felt, the temperature in the room plummeting, and a chilling wind sweeping through the hall. The flickering candles struggled against the oppressive darkness that seemed to close in on them. Emma's ghostly form materialized in the center of the room, her appearance more formidable than ever. Her eyes, filled with a mix of anguish and righteous fury, bore into the trio as she confronted them with her vengeful gaze. The spectral figure exuded an aura of intense malevolence, and the air was charged with an almost tangible sense of tension. "You have gathered to face me," Emma's voice echoed through the hall, cold and filled with sorrow. "Do you now understand the depth of your betrayal? Do you comprehend the weight of your actions?" David, Rachel, and Thomas stood together, their faces pale with fear and remorse. They had come to realize the gravity of their actions and the impact they had on Emma's life. The confrontation was not just a reckoning with the ghost, but also a confrontation with their own guilt and regret. Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling as she addressed Emma. "We are here to make amends, to face the truth of what we did. We understand now that our actions caused you great pain, and we are truly sorry for the suffering we inflicted upon you." Emma's spectral form flickered with a mix of anger and sadness. "Your apologies and remorse are insufficient. The pain you caused me cannot be undone with mere words. You must face the consequences of your actions and find a way to atone for your betrayal." Father Michael continued his prayers, invoking divine intervention to bring about a resolution. His voice was steady and resolute as he sought to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The atmosphere was thick with spiritual energy, and the group felt the weight of Emma's anger and sorrow. David, driven by a sense of guilt and determination, presented the items he had brought, evidence of his past actions and attempts to make amends. He spoke of his regrets and the steps he had taken to seek redemption. The act of presenting these items was a gesture of sincerity, a tangible representation of his remorse. Thomas, too, offered his own tokens of regret, personal items that symbolized his acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. He spoke earnestly of his understanding of Emma's suffering and his commitment to make things right. The weight of his words and actions was evident, and the room was filled with a profound sense of reflection. Emma's presence remained formidable, but her intensity seemed to waver as she observed the group's sincere efforts. The spiritual tension in the room began to shift, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lighten slightly. Father Michael's prayers grew more focused, invoking blessings of peace and forgiveness. As the ritual continued, Emma's spectral form began to dissipate, her anger and sorrow giving way to a sense of weary resignation. The energy in the room shifted, and the once chilling presence of the vengeful spirit began to fade. The candle's light grew steadier, and the temperature in the room began to normalize. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Emma's quest for vengeance had been met with a sincere attempt at reconciliation, and the spiritual resolution was beginning to take shape. The haunting was far from over, but the efforts of David, Rachel, and Thomas had brought them one step closer to finding peace. As the ritual concluded, Emma's presence diminished, leaving behind a sense of somber relief. The trio, exhausted and emotionally drained, stood in the aftermath of their confrontation. The house, once a place of foreboding, now felt like a quiet, empty space, a testament to the struggle they had endured. Father Michael offered words of reassurance and encouragement, acknowledging the courage and sincerity of the group's efforts. The road to redemption was still uncertain, but the confrontation with Emma had brought them closer to understanding and resolution. The final judgment had been met, and the haunting had reached a critical point. Emma's quest for vengeance had brought her former colleagues to face the consequences of their actions, and the spiritual reckoning had set the stage for a potential resolution. The journey was far from over, but the confrontation with Emma Black had marked a significant turning point. The echoes of the past would continue to resonate, but the path to redemption and closure was now more tangible than ever. Chapter 7: The Unfinished Symphony. The haunting of Emma Black had reached a tenuous equilibrium, but the resolution remained elusive. Despite the sincere efforts of David Harris, Rachel King, and Thomas Riley, Emma's spirit had not been fully appeased. The trio, though relieved, were acutely aware that their journey toward redemption was far from complete. In the aftermath of their confrontation with Emma, each of the three former colleagues tried to piece their lives back together. However, the lingering presence of the vengeful spirit cast a shadow over their attempts at normalcy. Emma's unresolved quest for justice seemed to echo in every corner of their lives, a constant reminder of their past transgressions. David, struggling with the weight of his guilt, decided to take a leave of absence from his job. He sought refuge in solitude, hoping that distance from his former life might offer him some clarity and relief. He retreated to a remote cabin in the woods, a place he had once found solace in, hoping that isolation might offer him a respite from the relentless torment. The cabin, nestled deep in the forest, was a refuge from the outside world. Its rustic charm and serene surroundings provided a stark contrast to the chaos David had experienced. However, as night fell, the eerie silence of the forest became a haunting backdrop for David's restless thoughts. The tranquility of the cabin was disrupted by unsettling occurrences. Shadows danced at the edge of his vision, and the once familiar creaks of the old building took on an ominous tone. Despite the isolation, David could not escape the feeling of being watched, and the ghosts of his past seemed to haunt him relentlessly. Rachel King, meanwhile, had attempted to seek solace in her work at the local charity, hoping that helping others might offer her a sense of redemption. Yet the memories of her encounter with Emma lingered, and the sense of dread never fully receded. Her attempts to find peace through her work were marred by a persistent sense of unease. The charity's office, once a place of community and support, felt increasingly claustrophobic. Rachel's colleagues noticed her growing distance and the pallor of fear that seemed to cling to her. Despite her best efforts to maintain a facade of normalcy, the unresolved tension of Emma's haunting had a profound impact on her emotional well-being. Thomas Riley, consumed by the weight of his actions and the encounter with Emma, had retreated into isolation. He sought comfort in the study of the occult and the supernatural, hoping to find answers and understanding. His research led him to delve into ancient texts and arcane rituals, driven by a desperate need to make sense of his experiences. One night, as Thomas worked late into the evening, he discovered an ancient manuscript detailing the life and death of Emma Black. The manuscript contained information about Emma's final moments and the powerful emotions that had bound her spirit to the mortal realm. The revelations offered new insights into Emma's quest for vengeance and the unresolved aspects of her haunting. The discovery prompted Thomas to reach out to David and Rachel, urging them to come together for a final attempt to resolve the haunting. He believed that understanding Emma's past and the depth of her suffering might offer a path to redemption. The trio agreed to meet at the old library, determined to confront their past and seek a resolution. The library, with its musty shelves and arcane texts, provided a fitting setting for their final effort. As they gathered, each was burdened by their own fears and regrets, but they were united by a shared sense of purpose. The library, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, was filled with an air of solemnity as the trio prepared for their final confrontation with Emma's spirit. The revelations from the manuscript offered hope, but the outcome remained uncertain. As they began their ritual, the temperature in the library dropped, and a sense of foreboding enveloped the room. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was charged with spiritual tension, and the group felt the weight of Emma's unresolved quest for justice. The final judgment was imminent, and the trio faced the daunting task of confronting their past actions and seeking a resolution to the haunting that had consumed their lives. The echoes of Emma Black's vengeance reverberated through the library, and the path to redemption was fraught with uncertainty. The old library where Thomas conducted his research was filled with dusty tomes and forgotten lore. The musty smell of old paper and ink provided a sense of connection to the past, but it also heightened his sense of isolation. His nights were spent poring over texts, searching for clues that might offer insight into Emma's lingering presence. As the days turned into weeks, each of the trio continued to struggle with their own demons. The haunting of Emma Black had left an indelible mark on their lives, and the quest for resolution seemed increasingly elusive. One evening, as David sat alone in his cabin, he was jolted by a sudden, violent knock at the door. The sound was sharp and insistent, cutting through the stillness of the night. David hesitated before opening the door, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. Standing on the threshold was a figure shrouded in darkness, their features obscured by the dim light. The figure's presence was both familiar and unsettling, and David's instinctive sense of dread deepened. The figure spoke in a low, chilling voice, their words barely audible. "David Harris," the voice intoned, "you cannot escape the consequences of your actions. The past cannot be buried, and the spirit of Emma Black demands justice." David's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the cabin. The air grew colder, and the once comforting surroundings of the cabin seemed to close in around him. The figure's presence was a stark reminder that the haunting was far from over. In the charity office, Rachel received a disturbing phone call late one night. The voice on the other end was distorted and eerie, speaking in hushed tones. The caller claimed to have knowledge of Rachel's past actions and demanded that she confront her guilt. Rachel's heart raced as she listened to the chilling message. The call left her shaken and anxious, further eroding her sense of security. The sense of dread that had accompanied her throughout her ordeal was now amplified by the disturbing communication. Thomas, in his solitary research, encountered a series of unsettling occurrences. Books flew from shelves, and strange symbols appeared on the walls of the library. The disturbances seemed to intensify as Thomas delved deeper into his studies, and the line between the supernatural and reality grew increasingly blurred. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The library, bathed in the flickering light of candles and the heavy atmosphere of anticipation, seemed to hold its breath as David, Rachel, and Thomas prepared for their final confrontation with Emma Black's spirit. The revelations from the manuscript had given them hope, but they knew that the road to redemption was fraught with peril. As the trio gathered around the old oak table in the center of the library, Thomas placed the ancient manuscript before them. The room was filled with the musty scent of old books and the faint aroma of the candles. The air was thick with tension, and the group's collective anxiety was palpable. Rachel, her hands trembling slightly, took a deep breath and began to read aloud from the manuscript. The text, written in an archaic script, detailed Emma's tragic story and the powerful emotions that had bound her spirit to the mortal realm. The manuscript revealed that Emma's death had been marked by profound betrayal and unfulfilled promises. David and Thomas listened intently, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. The manuscript described how Emma had been wronged by those she had trusted, and her spirit had become entangled in a cycle of vengeance as a result of the unresolved injustices she had suffered. The revelation in the manuscript painted a vivid picture of Emma's final moments. She had been betrayed by those she had once considered friends, and the sense of betrayal had fueled her anger and desire for retribution. The manuscript also hinted at a possible way to lay her spirit to rest, an act of sincere contrition and acknowledgement of the wrongs done to her. Rachel paused in her reading, her voice cracking with emotion. It says here that Emma's spirit cannot find peace until those responsible for her suffering confront the full truth of their actions and make amends. It speaks of a ritual that involves not just the acknowledgement of guilt, but a genuine act of restitution. David looked up, his eyes meeting Rachel's with a mixture of resolve and uncertainty. "What kind of restitution are we talking about? How do we make things right with Emma?" Thomas, his face pale and serious, answered, "The manuscript doesn't provide all the details, but it suggests that Emma's spirit is bound to the pain and betrayal she experienced. To release her, we need to not only acknowledge our guilt, but also offer a symbolic gesture of our regret and commitment to change." The group decided to follow the guidance of the manuscript and perform the ritual described within its pages. They gathered the necessary items, a collection of symbolic tokens, personal artifacts that represented their remorse, and a carefully prepared ritual offering. As they began the ritual, the atmosphere in the library grew increasingly charged with spiritual energy. The candles flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The temperature in the room dropped, and the air became thick with an almost palpable sense of expectation. Rachel, David, and Thomas stood in a circle around the ritual offering, each holding a personal artifact. They took turns speaking aloud, acknowledging their past actions and expressing their sincere regret. The ritual required them to confront their guilt openly and commit to making amends, not only for their own sake, but also for Emma's spirit. Rachel spoke first, her voice filled with sorrow. I acknowledge the pain I caused Emma and the betrayal I was a part of. I deeply regret my actions and the harm I inflicted. I am committed to making amends and ensuring that her memory is honored. David followed, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I recognize my role in the betrayal and the suffering that resulted. I am truly sorry for the pain I caused Emma and am dedicated to seeking redemption and preventing such wrongs from happening again. Thomas, the last to speak, added, I understand the gravity of my actions and the impact they had on Emma. I am deeply remorseful and committed to honoring her memory and ensuring that justice is served. As the ritual progressed, the library seemed to come alive with a swirling energy. The candles flickered and flared, and the temperature continued to fluctuate. The group could feel the presence of Emma's spirit growing stronger, as if she were responding to their sincere efforts. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind swept through the library, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. The atmosphere was charged with an intense, almost oppressive energy. The trio stood in the darkness, their hearts racing as they waited for any sign of Emma's presence. The darkness was punctuated by a sudden, eerie glow that illuminated the figure of Emma Black. Her spectral form appeared, more distinct and formidable than ever. Her eyes, once filled with anger and sorrow, now held a mixture of curiosity and tentative hope. Emma's voice, though still haunting, was softer and less accusatory. You have confronted your guilt and made your intentions known, but is it enough to release me from my torment? Rachel, her voice trembling, answered, We have done everything we can to acknowledge our wrongs and make amends. We understand that our actions caused you immense pain, and we are committed to honoring your memory and seeking justice. Emma's spirit seemed to waver, and the energy in the room shifted. The oppressive atmosphere began to lift, and a sense of calm began to replace the previous tension. The group could feel the weight of Emma's unresolved anger beginning to ease. The spectral figure of Emma took a step forward, her expression one of quiet contemplation. Your efforts have not gone unnoticed. Though my spirit has been bound by pain and betrayal, there is a glimmer of hope in your sincerity. The glow around Emma grew brighter, and the temperature in the room began to stabilize. The flickering light of the candles reappeared, casting a warm and steady illumination on the library. The oppressive darkness gave way to a sense of peaceful resolution. Emma's voice, now softer and more distant, spoke one final time. I am grateful for your efforts and your commitment to making things right. My spirit will find solace in the acknowledgement of my pain and the promise of change. As Emma's spectral form began to fade, the library was filled with a sense of calm and closure. The group watched as the haunting presence of Emma Black slowly dissipated, her spirit finding the peace it had long sought. The ritual had brought about a significant shift, and the trio felt a profound sense of relief and resolution. The echoes of Emma's vengeance had been addressed, and the path to redemption seemed clearer than ever. The library, once a place of fear and dread, now felt like a sanctuary of hope and understanding. The journey of redemption was far from over, but the final confrontation with Emma Black had marked a pivotal moment in their quest for resolution. Chapter 9. Echoes of Redemption. With Emma Black's spirit finally finding a measure of peace, David, Rachel, and Thomas began to piece their lives back together. The weight of their shared experience was heavy, but the resolution they had achieved brought a sense of tentative hope. As they emerged from the library into the light of a new day, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, and less oppressive. David returned to his remote cabin, but the haunting presence that had plagued him was now absent. The isolation, once filled with dread, now offered a peaceful retreat. The forest surrounding the cabin seemed to welcome him with a renewed sense of tranquility. David took solace in the natural beauty, finding a new perspective on his life and his actions. He spent his days reflecting on his past and considering how he could make amends beyond the ritual. The solitude provided him the space to confront his personal demons and to explore ways he could contribute positively to the community. His time at the cabin became a period of self-discovery and growth. Rachel resumed her work at the charity with a renewed sense of purpose. The emotional toll of the haunting had left her shaken, but it also ignited a deeper commitment to her work. She found strength in helping others and sought to use her experience to support those in need. Her interactions with the people she helped took on a more genuine and compassionate tone. Rachel's efforts did not go unnoticed. Her colleagues in the community began to see the transformation in her. The charity thrived under her leadership, and Rachel's dedication brought about tangible improvements in the lives of those she served. Her personal journey of redemption was intertwined with her professional achievements, and she found fulfillment in making a positive impact. Thomas continued his studies, but his focus shifted from the occult to more constructive and scholarly pursuits. The experience with Emma had profoundly changed his perspective. He used his knowledge to educate others about the history of the supernatural and the importance of understanding historical contexts in dealing with such phenomena. Thomas's research gained recognition, and he began to lecture on the subject, sharing his insights with a broader audience. His work contributed to a greater understanding of historical and cultural aspects of the supernatural, and his lectures were well received by those interested in the field. The trio's paths eventually converged as they reunited to discuss the aftermath of their ordeal. They met at a small cafe, a neutral and inviting space that contrasted with the grim atmosphere of the library where their journey had culminated. David, Rachel, and Thomas gathered around a table, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and contemplation. The cafe buzzed with the hum of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, providing a comforting backdrop for their discussion. Rachel was the first to speak. It's strange to think about how far we've come. Emma's haunting was terrifying, but it led us to confront our own actions and seek redemption. It's made me realize how important it is to make amends and help others. David nodded in agreement. I've found a new sense of purpose in my time at the cabin. It's given me the chance to reflect and find ways to contribute positively. I think the experience has changed us all in ways we didn't expect. Thomas added, our journey has taught us a lot about ourselves and about the importance of understanding and addressing the past. It's been a difficult road, but I believe we've come out of it stronger and more aware. The conversation turned to their plans for the future. Each of them had found a renewed sense of purpose, and they discussed ways they could continue to honor Emma's memory and the lessons they had learned from their experience. David expressed his desire to use his experience to raise awareness about the importance of acknowledging past mistakes and seeking personal growth. He planned to write a book documenting his journey and the lessons he had learned. Rachel spoke about her continued commitment to the charity and her plans to expand its outreach efforts. She wanted to ensure that the organization could make an even greater impact in the community and support those who needed it most. Thomas shared his intention to develop educational programs based on his research into the supernatural and its historical contexts. He hoped to provide valuable insights to students and enthusiasts interested in the subject. As they wrapped up their meeting, the trio felt a sense of closure and optimism. The echoes of Emma Black's vengeance had been addressed, and their paths to redemption had been forged through their shared experience. They understood that their journey had been more than a confrontation with a vengeful spirit. It had been a profound exploration of their own values, actions, and the power of redemption. The cafe, with its warm atmosphere and gentle buzz of activity, provided a fitting end to their discussion. As they left, they each felt a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to making a positive difference in their own ways. Emma Black's spirit, having found a measure of peace, had left an indelible mark on their lives. Her quest for justice had led them to confront their own shortcomings and seek redemption. The experience had transformed them, and their futures were now guided by a deeper understanding of the importance of acknowledging and addressing the past. The journey had been arduous and fraught with challenges, but it had ultimately brought them closer together and helped them find a sense of resolution. As they moved forward, they carried with them the lessons learned from their encounter with Emma Black and a renewed commitment to living lives of integrity and purpose. Chapter 10: The Final Rest. The days that followed Emma Black's resolution were filled with a sense of tentative peace. David, Rachel, and Thomas had each returned to their lives with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of themselves and their responsibilities. The haunting presence that had once overshadowed their lives had dissipated, leaving behind a profound impact on their hearts and minds. As they reflected on their journey, they began to understand that their confrontation with Emma had been more than a mere exorcism. It had been a transformative experience that had shaped their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. The trials they had faced had forged a bond between them, and their shared commitment to making amends and seeking redemption had become the cornerstone of their lives moving forward. David's book, which detailed his experiences and the lessons he had learned, was nearing completion. He poured his heart into the pages, recounting the harrowing events and the journey of personal growth that had followed. The book was not just a recounting of the supernatural events, but also an exploration of the human spirit and the power of redemption. Rachel's charity had flourished under her leadership. She had expanded its outreach and developed new programs to support those in need. The impact of her work was evident in the lives she touched, and her dedication had earned her recognition and respect from the community. Rachel found fulfillment in her role, knowing that she was making a difference and honoring the memory of those who had suffered. Thomas continued his research and education, but his focus had shifted to a more holistic approach to the study of the supernatural. He integrated his knowledge into broader historical and cultural contexts, providing valuable insights to students and enthusiasts. His work contributed to a greater understanding of the complexities of the supernatural and its influence on human history and culture. One quiet evening, the trio gathered once again in the library, the place where their journey had begun and culminated. The library was now a symbol of their shared experiences and the resolution they had achieved. The atmosphere was calm and reflective, a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had once pervaded the space. David, Rachel, and Thomas sat around the table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the reading lamps. They spoke of their progress and the impact of their experiences, sharing their thoughts and reflections on the journey they had undertaken. David looked at his friends with a sense of gratitude. It's hard to believe how far we've come. The journey with Emma was intense and challenging, but it has led us to a place of understanding and growth. I'm thankful for the support we've given each other. Rachel nodded in agreement. We've all changed in profound ways. The work we've done and the lives we've touched are a testament to the transformation we've undergone. I feel a deep sense of purpose and fulfillment in what I do now. Thomas added, our experience has given us a new perspective on the supernatural and on ourselves. The lessons we've learned have shaped our paths and helped us find our true calling. I believe we've honored Emma's memory by using our experiences to make a positive impact. As they spoke, a sense of closure and contentment filled the room. The library, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary of reflection and peace. The trials they had faced had led them to a place of resolution, and they were now able to look back with a sense of accomplishment and understanding. In the weeks that followed, the library became a symbol of their shared journey and the resolution they had achieved. David's book was published and received acclaim for its honest and introspective portrayal of their experiences. Rachel's charity continued to thrive, making a significant impact in the community. Thomas's research and lectures garnered respect and recognition, contributing to a greater understanding of the supernatural. The story of Emma Black and the resolution of her vengeance became a powerful narrative of redemption and growth. It served as a reminder of the importance of confronting the past, seeking forgiveness, and using one's experiences to make a positive difference in the world. As David, Rachel, and Thomas moved forward in their lives, they carried with them the lessons they had learned and the memories of their shared journey. They understood that their experiences had shaped them in profound ways and had given them a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the human spirit and the power of redemption. The final chapter of their story was one of hope and resolution. The echoes of Emma Black's vengeance had been laid to rest, and the trio had emerged from the experience with a renewed sense of purpose and a commitment to living lives of integrity and compassion. The library, once a place of fear, now stood as a testament to the transformative power of facing one's past and seeking redemption. It was a place of reflection, understanding, and hope, a fitting end to a journey that had touched the lives of all who had been involved. As they left the library for the final time, David, Rachel, and Thomas felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. They had faced their fears, confronted their guilt, and found a path to redemption. Their journey had come full circle, and they were ready to embrace the future with hope and determination. And so, our journey with Emma Black comes to a close. What began as a tale of vengeance and supernatural terror has transformed into a powerful story of redemption and growth. David, Rachel, and Thomas faced their deepest fears and confronted the shadows of their pasts. Through their trials, they discovered the true meaning of resolution and the power of making amends. As the echoes of Emma's vengeance faded into the past, the trio emerged with newfound purpose and understanding. David's journey of self-reflection led him to share his story with the world, offering insight and hope. Rachel's unwavering dedication to her charity brought light to those in need, honoring the lessons learned from their ordeal. Thomas's scholarly pursuits helped others understand the complexities of the supernatural, bridging the gap between history and the unknown. Their experiences remind us that even in the darkest moments, there is hope for redemption and healing. Emma Black's story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the importance of confronting our past to build a better future. As we close this chapter, we are left with a message of reconciliation and the promise of positive change. May we all carry the lessons of this journey with us, finding strength in our own paths to redemption and compassion. Thank you for joining us on this haunting and transformative journey. If you've enjoyed The Vengeance of Emma Black, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with others who may appreciate a gripping tale of the supernatural. Until next time, keep seeking the light amidst the shadows, and remember, redemption is always within reach. Stay tuned for more stories that delve into the unknown. Good night and sweet dreams.